Between 2010 and 2012, EU member states registered over 30,000 victims of trafficking in human beings. It's something that the EU has been trying to deal with for many years. Myria Vassiliadou is the EU's anti-trafficking coordinator, and she joins us on the Cyprus News Digest to tell us about the latest figures. Myria, are we getting anywhere with this? You've been working so hard for many years, and yet over 30,000 victims is an awful lot of totally destroyed lives.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you for the question. Are we getting anywhere? I would say that, first of all, the 30,000 registered victims would be only the beginning of this story. There's a lot more victims that are for sure not identified in all the member states everywhere across the EU. So we are talking about an awful lot of lives indeed. We are getting somewhere at the EU level in the sense that we have very good legislation, an EU directive that the member states have adopted. Most of the member states have notified the European Commission that they have now translated this EU law into their national law. We have a very good policy framework, and we have funding that is enabling and supports the member states' activities. So I guess the question would be, if everything is in place, why is it that we have so much trafficking? And I think our answer should be in the implementation of the EU legal framework. We have the laws, we have the tools, let's put everything into practice.
Well, a lot of countries, and I'm afraid I think Cyprus is among them, are not really following the letter of the law, are they? Is it actually a law?
Well, it is a law in the sense that it should be a law. Basically, Cyprus, like 24 other member states, have told the Commission that they have translated this law into national law, so the law should be in place. What we're doing now is we're looking into all the member states and how they translated the legislation. And of course, we will not hesitate where it hasn't been done properly to take member states to the next level and even to the court. I think that what we need to focus on is precisely to ensure that the law is enforced and to deal with what trafficking is really about. Trafficking is not about vulnerability of people. Of course, people are vulnerable to many things, trafficking being one of them. But trafficking happens because there's money and because there is demand. So without people profiting from the services of the victims and using those services of the victims, there is no trafficking. So Cyprus, like all the other member states, needs to pay a lot of attention to these two factors.
Can we come now on to October 18th? That was Anti-trafficking Day, and it was marked, I think, in Brussels and the rest of Europe. What actually happened to mark the day? And Myria, what was the feeling that you got from the member states about how they are trying to support this initiative?
On the 18th of October, indeed, is the EU Anti-trafficking Day. We marked the 8th Anti-trafficking Day. And what we did, we presented a report at the EU level, a package against trafficking in human beings. And it was basically 3 reports. The first one was the midterm report on what we have done in relation to the strategy of the EU against trafficking in the last 2.5 years. So we reported on the policy framework and the implementation. And I'm very proud, having monitored its implementation, that we have indeed implemented all the actions we have promised to present date. We have also presented a report on data, so the latest statistics we have on registered victims from the member states, with very interesting results. And we have presented another report on another directive which relates to whether victims of trafficking, how many victims of trafficking are granted permits to remain in the EU once they're identified as trafficked.
Right, that's the directive on residence permits, I think?
That is the so-called 2004 directive, yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? Because that's something I think that's very pertinent to the victims that we have in Cyprus.
Well, it is. What we have is an EU legislation dating back to 2004 that states that non-EU nationals that are identified as victims of trafficking, under certain considerations, can be granted permits to remain in the EU as appropriate. And what we have found with the report that we have issued last week is that the directive is not as used as it could be, as widely used as it could be, and not always in an appropriate manner. So we have to encourage the member states indeed to take actions to ensure better implementation of the directive. So again, it is about implementation rather than necessarily a problem with the law itself.
What can you or the Commission actually do in cases where countries aren't properly implementing the law? I mean, do you have any teeth, as it were, Myria?
Well, the European Commission certainly has teeth. The language to be using would be, yes, we can launch infringement procedures. In reality, what that means is that the member states could potentially end up going to the court, the European Court of Justice. And of course, when it comes to the issue of trafficking in human beings, I hope that this is not something that we will end up having to do. Number one, because the aim is not to punish the member states for not implementing the law. The aim is to encourage member states to do so, because in doing so, they help people, they help victims. It is in the interest of the EU, of the member states, of you, of me, of the society, and of the victims that the law is implemented. And number two, I don't know, I cannot think of any member states who would like to say that they haven't taken the right steps to prevent human trafficking. This in some ways a form of slavery. And I don't know if member states will want to be seen in that way. And indeed, I think the member states are doing a lot more than they were in the past. I see a lot more awareness, a lot more activity at the member state level, a lot more interest in the work that is being done also at the EU level, more cooperation with the civil society. There is a long road ahead, and I'm not in any way saying that everything is done as it should be. But I do see more work and more interest and more commitment. And also at the EU level, the President-elect, Mr. Juncker, has put trafficking in his political agenda as a priority. Mr. Avramopoulos, who is our Commissioner-elect, he's now the Commissioner of Migration and Home Affairs, who is responsible for the area of trafficking, has already stipulated that trafficking is one of the areas that he will certainly support and promote at the EU level. So we're on the right track, but there's a lot more to be done. And what is also interesting, because you mentioned the 2004 directive, it's very important to remember that most of the victims identified in the EU are EU citizens. So we may want to think that we have a lot of non-EU citizens who are trafficked, and we possibly do. But in reality, most of the victims who are registered with the authorities are EU nationals. Most of the suspected traffickers are EU nationals. And I would estimate that all, if nearly all, of the users are EU nationals. So at the end of the day, it goes back to the demand. Who uses the services of these people? It's us. It's EU nationals.
Myria, can we just clarify for people exactly what we're talking about here? Because I think the figure is close to 3/4 of trafficked people are trafficked for sexual exploitation. But aren't there, several other categories that we really ought to be aware of? What exactly should we be looking out for?
We have trafficking for sexual exploitation, for labor exploitation, for domestic servitude, for the purpose of organ removal, to force people to engage in criminal activities, forced begging. Unfortunately, we have a very long list. Now we hear also stories about people being forced into sham marriages. So we have a lot of forms of exploitation. And it's very easy to say it has nothing to do with us. It's very easy to turn a blind eye and to say it's a hidden phenomenon. But it is not always hidden. So there's a lot that we can do. We can ask people that we are in any way paying, either through contracts or non-contracts, more informal economy. We can ask them to see their papers, to see, not necessarily their papers, but that they're working there in their own free will. Is there somebody behind them asking them to do the job that they're doing? Is there anything we can do to help them? If we are employing domestic workers, for example, are we sure that these people are not part of a bigger scum? We know that there is trafficking in domestic servitude, actually. We know that there's a lot of people begging in the streets or engaging in criminal activities, and we immediately assume that they are part of some organized gang, but maybe they're victims of an organized network. When it comes to children, for example, sometimes those children are not necessarily in any way related to the people that they're working for, but they're forced to do what they do. Sometimes they're convinced that if they go to the authorities, they will be imprisoned, which of course that shouldn't happen, that they would be punished. So we have to be more alert into what we buy, whose services we're using. When it comes to sexual exploitation, of course, there are people who do things in their own free will and legally or in the regular, less regulated market. But there are many women and girls, especially, who are forced. We see documentaries all the time who expose these things. So it wouldn't be bad to be a little bit more careful into our practices and our habits and not taking for granted that people want to be doing the things they do.
Which brings us to a couple of other things. One is the number of convictions for trafficking. Has that in any way improved?
It is very difficult with the data we have available to compare. We have about 3,500 convictions at the EU level. But if we know that there's potentially tens of thousands of victims, I would assume that there's a lot of convictions that haven't taken place. So we are encouraging and pushing the member states to be doing a lot more in that direction. And you give me the opportunity to say something once more. This is not the European Commission telling the member states, oh, you have to implement EU law. This is about the member states protecting their citizens, protecting people who live in Europe, citizens and non-EU citizens, and protecting the legal economy. Because all this trafficking, also for labor exploitation, for example, comes at the detriment of the legal economy, of the legal businesses going about doing their work. So it hurts the victims, it hurts the society, and it hurts the economy. It hurts everybody. There's nobody who wins apart from the criminals.
And finally, Myria, I seem to recall the last time you were in Cyprus, and I think it was probably around this time last year, the EU Parliament, lobbied by women's groups, had passed a resolution accepting or recommending that in cases of prostitution, the prostitute herself or himself shouldn't be classed as the criminal. Now, what's happened with that? A few countries adopted it. Has it made any difference whatsoever?
There are a number of issues here. First of all, to clarify that when it comes to the policy surrounding prostitution, the Commission has no opinion. It is up to the member states to decide. But what is very clear, and this comes from the law enforcement, from intelligence gathering, from everybody, is that prostitution is a high-risk sector. So you as a journalist, there's a lot of horrible things that can happen to a journalist, but trafficking is not one of them necessarily. When it comes to prostitution, it is extremely likely that is linked to trafficking and organized crime. So to quote a German high-ranking police officer recently, she said, all the people identified in trafficking for sexual exploitation were in the prostitution market. So that we have to take. The European Commission can act when there is a link between prostitution and trafficking. What the European Parliament says is that in order to ensure that we eradicate demand, we stop the demand, Some parliamentarians recommend that we are closer to a model whereby we criminalize the buyers of prostitution. The Commission has absolutely no opinion on that. What the Commission says is that we need to look very carefully. In fact, all the member states, including Cyprus, are legally obliged to consider criminalizing those who knowingly, and I stress knowingly, make use of the services of victims of trafficking. And I want to leave your audience with a question. If we know of any other area of crime, because trafficking in human beings is a crime, where the person is in some way involved or aware of the crime and instigating the crime in any way, and is not criminalized. And we have no other such examples. So if we consider trafficking as a crime, which it is, stipulated in the EU Treaty as well, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, then we have to think of how we stop the crime. And is the answer, if we don't criminalize the crime, not prostitution, the crime of trafficking for sexual exploitation, for example, if we don't criminalize that, are we suggesting impunity to those involved?
And are we perhaps suggesting that consumers of these basically illegal activities are accessories?
Exactly. So would we accept, for example, if there is a domestic worker, actually a servant, in the sense that someone is trafficked in a house, you know that they're trafficked, you know that you don't pay for the services, or you know that somebody's behind them taking their money, and so on, and you just accept that. You're not criminalized in the majority of member states at the moment. You are criminalized if the person is a third country national, but not if it's an EU national, which is, again, something we need to be thinking about very carefully. So yes, the Commission has a big say when it comes to trafficking for sexual exploitation and how this links to the exploitation of the prostitution of others. But when it comes to pure prostitution policy, we have absolutely no comment. And of course, we don't think that prostitution and trafficking are the same thing. This is very clear. But whether there are links, of course there are links.
Myria Vassiliadou, EU Anti-trafficking Coordinator. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Many thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Rosie, and thank you for all the work in ensuring awareness on the issue and being consistent about it. This is great. Thank you so much.